It was supposed to be a routine stop, just another car rolling through a stop sign. Officer Daniel Reeves had done this 1,000 times. But when he looked into the back seat, he saw a little girl clutching a doll too tightly, her eyes filled with silent fear. Something was wrong. His gut told him to dig deeper, but with no proof, he let them go. Hours later, when he checked the footage, his blood ran cold. The girl had whispered 2 silent words, "Help me." What happened next turned into a race against time, and a fight against something far more sinister than he ever imagined. The suburban streets were unusually quiet that evening. Officer Daniel Reeves had been patrolling for hours, the steady hum of his cruiser's engine filling the silence between occasional radio chatter. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearing 9 o'clock, and so far his shift had been uneventful. No major incidents, just a few minor infractions. The kind of night that lulled officers into a false sense of routine. But Daniel knew better than to let his guard down. Experience had taught him that trouble often hid in the quietest moments. As he approached an intersection, the headlights of his patrol car caught movement up ahead. A dark blue sedan glided through a stop sign without hesitation. It wasn't speeding, and it didn't swerve, but it didn't even attempt to slow down. Daniel sighed. A stop sign was a stop sign. He reached for the switch and flicked on his patrol lights, signaling the driver to pull over. The sedan hesitated for a brief moment before easing to the side of the road. Daniel radioed in the stop as he parked behind it, his voice calm and professional. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reeves. I'm conducting a routine traffic stop on a dark blue sedan, plate number 8XJ472. No assistance needed at this time." He unbuckled his seatbelt, his trained eyes scanning the vehicle as he stepped out. Years on the force had given him an instinct for spotting things that didn't feel right, even in the simplest of situations. The way the sedan had hesitated before pulling over lingered in his mind, but he pushed the thought aside. It was likely nothing. As he approached the driver's side window, it rolled down smoothly. The man behind the wheel had a practiced smile, his posture relaxed, yet deliberate. He looked to be in his late 40s, neatly dressed in a button-down shirt. There was something about his demeanor, too friendly, too composed. "Good evening, officer," the man greeted, his voice warm but rehearsed. "Something wrong?" Daniel offered a neutral nod. "Evening. You rolled through a stop sign back there. Any reason for the rush?" The man let out a soft chuckle. My apologies. It's late, and I guess I wasn't paying enough attention. Just trying to get home." Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted his focus slightly, glancing into the car's interior. That was when he saw her. In the back seat, a little girl sat clutching a worn-out doll. She looked no older than 7, her blonde hair falling in loose waves around her pale face. Her frame was stiff, her posture unnaturally rigid. Her hands gripped the doll so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She met his gaze, and for a fraction of a second, he saw something that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. A smile, but not a real one. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel turned his attention back to the driver. "License and registration, please." The man reached into the glove compartment without hesitation, pulling out the requested documents and handing them over with ease. "Richard Vaughn," he introduced himself casually, "and this here is my daughter, Lily. We've been at my sister's house for a late family dinner. Lily's pretty wiped out, as you can see." Daniel studied the girl again. She bobbed her head slightly in agreement, but her movements felt wrong, like she was forcing herself to act natural. He looked back at Vaughn, noting the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool night air. Something about this wasn't sitting right. "Lily, is that right?" Daniel asked, directing his voice to the girl. She nodded again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." Before Daniel could ask anything else, Vaughn quickly interjected. "She's just tired. Long night, you know how it is." Daniel's gut tightened. Vaughn's response had been too quick, too eager to explain. "Where's home?" Daniel asked casually, keeping his tone even. "Just outside of town," Vaughn replied effortlessly. "Near Meadowbrook Lane." The answer came without hesitation, but Daniel didn't miss the flicker of unease in Vaughn's expression. It was subtle, but it was there. He glanced down at the license and registration. Everything checked out. Richard Vaughn. Meadowbrook Lane. Vehicle registered to his name. Legally, there was nothing suspicious here, and yet Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. You seem like a family man, Mr. Vaughn, Daniel said, watching for a reaction. Not often I see a father and daughter out this late. Vaughn chuckled again, though the sound felt hollow. Yeah, well, it's not every day we stay out this late, but family is important, you know? Daniel forced a polite nod. Of course, just be sure to come to a full stop at intersections. It's for everyone's safety. Vaughn nodded eagerly. Absolutely, officer. Won't happen again. Daniel took a step back from the car, still feeling that itch of unease. He wanted to press further, to ask more questions, but without any legal reason to detain them, he knew he couldn't justify it. All right, he said, suppressing his hesitation. You're good to go. Drive safe. Vaughn smiled, a little too wide. Thank you, officer. You have a good night. The sedan pulled away smoothly, disappearing down the road. Daniel watched it go, his hand unconsciously resting on his holster. That gnawing feeling in his chest wouldn't leave. The driver's polite but overly controlled demeanor, the girl's unsettling stillness, the way she had flinched just slightly when Vaughn had looked at her. None of it sat right. He walked back to his cruiser, sliding into the driver's seat but not turning on the ignition. Instead, he reached for his notebook and jotted down the license plate number. His gut told him this wasn't over. Daniel had no way of knowing it yet, but the little girl clutching that doll wasn't Richard Vaughn's daughter, and he had just let her drive away with a man who had no intention of taking her home. Back at the precinct, Officer Daniel Reeves sat at his desk, but his mind wasn't on the paperwork in front of him. His fingers tapped absently against the wood, his thoughts circling back to the traffic stop from earlier that night. Something about it just wouldn't let go. It wasn't the stop sign violation. It wasn't the driver, Richard Vaughn, though his overly polished demeanor had put Daniel on edge. It was the girl, Lily. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Her face lingered in his mind, the forced smile, the stiffness in her posture, the way she had clutched that doll like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. And then there was the way she had subtly recoiled when Vaughn glanced at her, as if expecting something bad to happen. Daniel had been a cop long enough to know when something felt off, and this felt very off. He sighed, flipping open his notebook to the page where he had jotted down Vaughn's license plate. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to his computer and typed it into the system, running a routine check. The results popped up almost instantly. Richard Vaughn, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, vehicle registered to his name, address listed in Meadowbrook Lane, just outside of town. On paper, everything looked clean. So, why did it feel so wrong? Still unsettled, Daniel leaned forward and pulled up the dash cam footage from his patrol car. The video loaded, showing the moment he had approached Vaughn's vehicle. He watched Vaughn's face carefully, taking in every detail, the forced smile, the too easy charm. Then Daniel paused the video and zoomed in on the back seat. Lily sat there, small and silent, the doll clutched against her chest. Her lips moved slightly, barely noticeable. Daniel frowned. He rewound the footage, slowing it down to half speed. He watched again. This time, he saw it. Her lips moved, forming two silent words. Help me. Daniel's stomach dropped. His heartbeat picked up speed as he hit rewind and played it again, just to be sure. The motion was clear. She wasn't just fidgeting. She wasn't just mouthing nonsense. She was begging for help. His grip tightened around the computer mouse as he sat up straighter, every nerve in his body on high alert. He had been right. Something was very wrong. A sharp breath escaped his lips as he quickly switched screens and ran a new search. This time, not on Vaughn, but on missing persons. He filtered for recent Amber Alerts, narrowing it down to cases involving young girls. It only took a few seconds before a report flashed onto the screen. Daniel's entire body went still. Lily Thompson. Age, 7. Missing from Ridgewood, approximately 50 miles away. Last seen at a playground 3 days ago. Daniel's fingers clenched into a fist. The report included a description. A blonde-haired girl, last seen wearing a blue dress, carrying a stuffed toy doll. His breath caught in his throat. It was her. Lily wasn't Vaughn's daughter. She was a missing child, and he had just let her drive away with the man who had taken her. Daniel shoved back his chair, grabbing his radio. His voice was clipped and urgent as he spoke into the receiver. Dispatch, this is Officer Reeves. I need an immediate APB on a dark blue sedan, plate 8XJ472, registered to Richard Vaughn. Possible child abduction case. Child matches an active Amber Alert. Notify State Patrol and surrounding precincts. This is priority 1. There was a brief pause, then the dispatcher's voice crackled through. Copy that, Officer Reeves. Alerting all units now. Stand by for updates. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he clipped the radio back to his vest. His mind raced. He had to find them. Vaughn wouldn't take Lily back to his listed address. If he was smart, and he seemed to be, he would be on the move, getting as far away as possible before authorities caught on. Daniel needed to think like him. His eyes darted back to the dash cam footage. Vaughn had been too calm, too controlled. That meant he had done this before. Daniel flipped back to his computer, expanding his search. This time, he widened the database to check Vaughn's name across multiple states. The results came back within seconds, and what he found made his blood run cold. Vaughn's name had appeared in multiple suspicious activity reports over the past 5 years. Never arrested, never charged, but mentioned in several missing child cases. Each time, it had been the same. A well-dressed man traveling with a young child. A concerned bystander reporting something off, but nothing ever stuck. The children were never found. Vaughn had always slipped through the cracks. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a one-time abduction. Vaughn was a predator, and if Daniel didn't stop him now, Lily would disappear, just like the others. The weight of it settled heavily on his chest, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford hesitation. Not now. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Monroe, a female voice answered after 2 rings, brisk and no nonsense. Ava, it's Daniel, he said, his voice sharp with urgency. I need your help. Now. There was a beat of silence before Detective Ava Monroe responded, her tone immediately alert. What's going on? I stopped a car earlier tonight. A guy named Richard Vaughn. Something felt wrong, but I let him go. Just ran his plate. Turns out the girl in the back seat is a missing child. Active Amber Alert. Ava cursed under her breath. Tell me you have a lead. Not yet, but I'm about to. Daniel clicked open another window, accessing the nearest traffic cam feeds along the highway leading out of town. If Vaughn was on the move, the cameras would catch him. He scanned the timestamps, his eyes darting over the screen. Then, there. The blue sedan. It had been caught on camera at a gas station off Highway 17, 20 minutes ago. Vaughn had stopped for gas. Daniel's adrenaline spiked. Got him. He stopped at a gas station off 17. If we move fast, we can still catch him before he disappears for good. I'll meet you there, Ava said without hesitation. We need to move before he realizes he's being hunted. Daniel grabbed his jacket and sprinted toward his cruiser, his jaw set with determination. He had made one mistake letting Vaughn go. He wasn't going to make another. Officer Daniel Reeves gripped the steering wheel of his cruiser, his jaw clenched as he sped down the nearly deserted highway. The distant glow of streetlights flickered against the windshield, the weight of his earlier mistake pressing against his chest like a vice. He had let her go. Lily Thompson, 7 years old, missing for 3 days, had been sitting right in front of him, and he had watched as her abductor, Richard Vaughn, drove her away into the night. But that wouldn't be the end of the story. He wasn't going to lose her. His radio crackled to life. Reeves, this is Monroe. I just left the precinct. ETA 10 minutes to the gas station. You got eyes on anything yet? Detective Ava Monroe was one of the best, sharp, relentless, and not one to back down when it came to cases like this. Not yet, Daniel replied, scanning the highway for any sign of Vaughn's sedan. Traffic cam picked him up at the gas station about 20 minutes ago. If we're lucky, we can still pick up his trail before he goes completely off-grid. You think he's figured out we're onto him? Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. He's been doing this for years without getting caught. If he gets even a whiff of trouble, he'll disappear. Then we better move fast, Ava said. See you there. The radio clicked off. Daniel pushed the gas pedal harder, the needle on the speedometer creeping higher. His sirens were off, no flashing lights. The last thing he wanted was to tip Vaughn off if he was still in the area. The gas station loomed ahead, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the dark. Daniel pulled into the lot, scanning the few cars parked near the pumps. No dark blue sedan. Damn it. He parked near the entrance and stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement as he walked toward the small convenience store. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a stale mix of cigarette smoke and cheap coffee into the cool night air. A young attendant stood behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. He looked up as Daniel approached, his expression shifting from boredom to mild curiosity. "Evening, officer. Something wrong?" Daniel pulled out his badge. "Looking for someone. He would have been here about 20 minutes ago. Middle-aged guy, dark blue sedan, traveling with a little girl. Ring any bells?" The attendant frowned, setting his phone down. "Yeah, actually, I remember him. He came in, filled up his tank, bought some snacks. Looked like he was in a hurry." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Did the girl say anything?" The kid hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "Not really. She looked off, though, like real quiet, clutching this doll like it was the only thing keeping her together. And when she dropped it, the guy snapped at her, called her stupid." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "Did you see which way they went?" The attendant nodded. "Yeah, they pulled out onto Pine Street, headed south toward the highway." Daniel turned to leave, but the attendant's voice stopped him. "Hey, officer." Daniel glanced back. "That girl," the kid said, his voice quieter now. "She looked scared." Daniel gave a small nod. "I know." He pushed through the doors, stepping back into the night, just as Ava Monroe's car pulled into the lot. She barely had time to step out before Daniel was striding toward her. "He was here," he said, "about 20 minutes ago, headed south toward the highway." Ava cursed under her breath. Then we're running out of time. Daniel's mind was already working through the possibilities. Vaughn wasn't a first-time offender. He knew how to stay under the radar. He wouldn't go back to his listed address on Meadowbrook Lane. That was the first place cops would look. So where would he go? "Think like him," Daniel muttered, staring down the dark stretch of road. "He's been doing this for years. He's methodical. He doesn't take unnecessary risks." Ava crossed her arms. If he's on the move, he's got a destination. Somewhere he feels safe. Somewhere he knows no one will come looking. Daniel's mind raced through Vaughn's patterns, the missing child cases he had been loosely tied to. He always grabbed children from public spaces, parks, playgrounds, streets where parents weren't watching. But the locations where they were last seen, they were always different. It was the disappearances that followed a pattern. "They vanish for a few days," Daniel said, thinking aloud. "Then Vaughn moves them." Ava's eyes narrowed. "Moves them to where?" Daniel inhaled sharply. "A motel." Vaughn didn't take his victims straight to wherever he planned to keep them. He held them somewhere short-term first, somewhere isolated, where no one would hear a child crying for help. "There's only one cheap motel along this route," Daniel said, already turning toward his cruiser. "Lakeside Inn." Ava didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The Lakeside Inn was a rundown, one-story motel just off the highway, the kind of place that barely functioned as a business, catering mostly to drifters and people who didn't want to be found. As Daniel and Ava pulled into the lot, his eyes immediately landed on a familiar vehicle, dark blue sedan, parked near the far end of the motel. Daniel's pulse kicked up. Ava parked beside him, both of them keeping their movements slow and measured. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice steady. Daniel nodded once, gripping the handle of his holstered gun. "Let's move." They stepped out into the night, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached the motel's front office. A tired-looking clerk barely glanced up from behind the counter as they entered. Daniel flashed his badge. "We're looking for a guest, middle-aged man, checked in with a little girl about 20 minutes ago." The clerk squinted, rubbing his eyes. "Room 14, paid cash." Daniel exchanged a look with Ava. "We need the key." The clerk hesitated. "Something wrong?" Ava's tone was sharp. "Just give us the key." Muttering under his breath, the clerk slid a metal key across the counter. Daniel grabbed it, already moving. Back outside, they approached room 14. The curtains were drawn, but the faint glow of a light seeped through the edges. Daniel could see a shadow moving inside. Vaughn. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then his eyes flicked lower, and he saw her. Lily. Sitting on the edge of the bed, still clutching that doll. His grip tightened around his gun. "We go in careful," Ava whispered. "No sudden moves." Daniel nodded, but before they could act, the door to the room creaked open. Vaughn stepped out, lighting a cigarette, completely unaware of what was waiting for him in the darkness. Daniel exhaled sharply. "This is our chance." And just like that, the hunt was over. It was time to take Vaughn down. But tonight, there would be no slipping away into the shadows. Officer Daniel Reeves and Detective Ava Monroe stood near the far end of the lot, their eyes locked on room 14. Vaughn's dark blue sedan sat parked just a few feet away. He was here, and so was Lily. Daniel's pulse was steady, but his grip on his weapon was firm. He'd been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. A little girl's life was on the line. Ava glanced at him. He doesn't know we're here. Daniel exhaled. Let's keep it that way. They took slow, measured steps toward the room, moving in sync, keeping to the shadows. Daniel's eyes flicked to the window, the faint glow of a bedside lamp seeping through the curtains. Inside, a figure paced anxiously. Vaughn, but it was the small shape on the bed that made Daniel's chest tighten. Lily. She was sitting motionless, clutching that worn-out doll to her chest like a lifeline. Her posture was the same as it had been in the car, rigid, silent, terrified. Daniel clenched his jaw. Not anymore. They reached the door. Ava leaned in slightly listening, muffled movement, Vaughn talking to himself, an occasional shuffle of feet against the floor. Then the sound of a lock clicking open. Daniel's heart jumped as the door creaked open. Vaughn stepped out, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He exhaled a slow stream of smoke, his eyes scanning the empty lot. He hadn't seen them yet. Daniel and Ava exchanged a look. This was their chance. Moving fast and silent, Daniel grabbed Vaughn's wrist and twisted it behind his back before he could react. The cigarette hit the ground, the embers flaring for half a second before being crushed under Daniel's boot. Vaughn let out a startled grunt, struggling instinctively, but Ava was already on the other side, snapping the handcuffs onto his wrists. "What the hell?" Vaughn snarled, his polished demeanor cracking into raw panic. "Richard Vaughn," Daniel said, his voice cold and controlled, "you're under arrest for the abduction of Lily Thompson." Vaughn froze, his expression twisting into something ugly and calculating. Then he smirked. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You have no idea what's coming." Daniel ignored him. "Where's the key to the room?" Vaughn didn't answer. Ava patted him down quickly, pulling the key from his pocket. Daniel turned toward room 14, every nerve in his body on edge. Lily was still in there. His hand tightened around the key. Then, just as he slid it into the lock, a blur of motion shot past him. Daniel's heart stopped for half a second before reality crashed down. Lily, she had bolted. Her small frame darted from the room, feet pounding against the pavement, heading straight for the woods behind the motel. Daniel cursed under his breath. She was running, not just from Vaughn, from them. Ava cursed too. She's terrified. She doesn't know we're the good guys. Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran. The woods were thick and tangled, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, snagging at Daniel's uniform as he ran. The faint glow of his flashlight cut through the shadows, bouncing wildly as he pushed forward. "Lily!" he called, his voice steady but urgent. "It's okay. I'm Officer Reeves. I'm here to help you." No response, just the sound of small feet crashing through the undergrowth. Daniel pushed forward, his pulse hammering. The forest felt alive, every rustle sending his instincts into overdrive. Then he saw her, a small shape crouched near a tree, her tiny hands clutching her doll. She was trembling, her wide eyes darting in panic. Daniel slowed his pace. He knew better than to charge forward. She was already terrified. "Lily," he said softly, his breathing heavy but controlled. "You're safe now. You don't have to run." She didn't move. She just stared. Then, a sound behind him. Daniel's blood turned to ice. A footstep. Not his. Someone else was here. He turned just in time to see the shadow lunging at him. A flash of metal. Daniel barely dodged, twisting just as a knife slashed through the space where his chest had been. His flashlight hit the ground, the beam spinning wildly as he grappled with the attacker in the darkness. Ava had been right. Vaughn wasn't alone. Daniel barely registered the figure. A man, masked, taller than Vaughn, but just as desperate. The attacker lunged again. Daniel grabbed his wrist, twisting the knife from his grip, but the man was fast. He slammed an elbow into Daniel's ribs, making him stumble back against a tree. Pain shot through him, but he didn't let go. He forced the man's arm behind his back, using his weight to pin him down. The man thrashed, snarling like a cornered animal, but Daniel was stronger. With one final jerk, he snapped the handcuffs around his wrists. The fight was over. Daniel shoved the man to the ground, breathing hard. Then, he turned back toward Lily. She was watching, her tiny body still shaking. He crouched down, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "Lily," he said again. "He's gone. No one's going to hurt you now." She didn't move. Then, her grip on the doll loosened. Her eyes filled with tears. And then, in the smallest voice, she whispered, "Are you really a police officer?" Daniel's throat tightened. He nodded. "I am." Lily hesitated. Then, finally, she took a shaky step forward. Daniel held out his hand, and this time, she took it. Relief crashed over him, but he held it back. He lifted her carefully, holding her close as he carried her out of the woods. Her small fingers clutched the fabric of his uniform, and for the first time, she let herself cry. Daniel held her tighter, his voice steady. "You're safe now, Lily." This time, she believed him. The night air was heavy with tension as Daniel Reeves carried Lily out of the woods, her small fingers still clutching the fabric of his uniform. She had finally stopped running, finally let herself trust him. But this wasn't over. The motel parking lot came into view through the trees, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. As soon as they emerged, Ava Monroe was there, gun drawn, keeping Vaughn pinned against the squad car. "You got her?" she called, relief flickering in her voice as her eyes landed on Lily. "Yeah," Daniel breathed. "She's okay." Lily's tiny body trembled against him, but she was safe. For now. But Vaughn was smirking. Even with his hands cuffed behind his back, even with his face pressed against the car, he wasn't afraid. Daniel knew that look. He'd seen it before in criminals who thought they'd already won. "Check the woods," Daniel ordered, his voice sharp. "I caught one of them, but there might be more." Ava nodded, signaling the backup officers arriving on scene. As another officer took custody of Vaughn, Daniel turned back toward room 14. The door was still open. The dim glow of the motel lamp spilled out onto the pavement, illuminating the inside of Vaughn's hideout. Daniel swallowed hard and stepped inside. Inside the motel room, the smell hit him first, stale smoke and cheap cologne mixed with something rotten underneath. The bed was unmade, the blankets twisted, as if someone had struggled against them. But it was the desk in the corner that made Daniel's blood run cold. Scattered across it were forged documents, fake custody papers, fake passports, and a ledger filled with dates and initials. Each one represented a child. His stomach twisted as he scanned the names, the chilling realization settling in. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was part of something bigger. Daniel reached for his radio. "Ava," he said, his voice tight. "Get in here, now." Seconds later, Ava stepped through the doorway. "What is it?" Daniel handed her the ledger. She flipped through the pages, her brows furrowing deeper with every turn. Her jaw clenched. "This is a trafficking operation." Daniel nodded. And Vaughn wasn't working alone. Vaughn's smirk. Outside, Vaughn sat in the back of a squad car, watching them from behind the window. Even in handcuffs, he still wore that smirk, like he knew something they didn't. Daniel stormed toward him, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Where were you taking her?" Daniel demanded. Vaughn leaned back, his face still a picture of calm arrogance. "You're making a mistake, officer," he said smoothly. "That girl's my daughter." Daniel's fists clenched. "You forged documents to make it look that way," Ava snapped. "You've been using that trick for years, but it's over now." Vaughn chuckled, shaking his head. "You think it's over?" His smirk widened. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Daniel stared him down, anger burning in his chest. "You're going away for the rest of your life," he said, "and if you think you're getting out of this, you're wrong." Vaughn tilted his head, that smirk never leaving his face. "Oh, officer," he murmured, "I'm not the one you should be worried about." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Ava stiffened beside him. They knew what he meant. This wasn't just about Vaughn. There were others. And they were still out there. A sudden cry made both officers turn. Lily! She was thrashing in another officer's arms, her small body racked with panic as they tried to put her in the back of a police cruiser. "No, no, please!" she sobbed. Daniel rushed over, his voice gentle but firm. "Lily, it's okay. You're safe." She shook her head violently, her tiny hands clutching at his uniform again. "Don't let them take me," she pleaded. Daniel felt his chest tighten. She didn't trust anyone, and after what she'd been through, why would she? He knelt down, keeping his voice steady. "Lily, listen to me," he said softly. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps, but she clung to his sleeve like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Ava crouched beside them. "Lily, do you remember your parents' names?" The little girl froze. Her lips trembled. "Mommy," she whispered. Daniel and Ava exchanged a glance. That was it. That was all they needed. Ava turned, calling out to dispatch. "Get me a trace on Lily Thompson's parents. We need to confirm they're still in town." As the officers worked, Daniel stayed beside Lily, his presence steady. "Do you remember where you live?" he asked gently. Lily's fingers tightened around her doll. "I just want to go home," she whispered. As the night dragged on, Daniel and Ava stayed at the scene, watching as evidence was bagged, Vaughn was transported, and backup officers combed through the woods, searching for more suspects. They both knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Ava crossed her arms. "That ledger? It's just a piece of something much bigger." Daniel exhaled sharply. "I know. They had Lily, they had Vaughn. But there were others out there, and they weren't going to stop until they found them all." As Daniel looked back at Lily, still clutching her doll with a faint spark of hope in her eyes, he knew one thing for certain. They weren't backing down. Not now, not ever. The fluorescent lights in the precinct cast a cold, sterile glow over the interrogation room. It was the kind of light that exposed everything: the sweat, the nervous tics, the silent admissions of guilt. But Richard Vaughn wasn't nervous. He sat across the metal table, calm and collected, his wrists cuffed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His posture was too relaxed, his expression just shy of amused. Like he wasn't the one sitting in an interrogation room. Like he still thought he was in control. Daniel Reeves had seen this type before. Men who thought they were untouchable. Men who had been getting away with their crimes for so long, they genuinely believed no one could stop them. He wasn't going to let Vaughn walk out of this. Not this time. Ava Monroe stepped into the room, a thick case file in her hands. She didn't bother sitting. She dropped the file onto the table with a heavy thud and then leaned forward, placing both hands on the cold metal. "Let's cut the act, Vaughn," she said, her tone razor sharp. "You're done." Vaughn smiled, actually smiled. "You're making a mistake, detective," he said smoothly. "You think you got me, but you don't. That girl, she's my daughter." Ava barely blinked. Daniel, standing just behind her, crossed his arms, jaw tight. Lily Thompson had been reunited with her parents an hour ago. DNA confirmation, tearful reunion. A mother sobbing into her daughter's hair. A father holding his child like he'd never let go again. And yet, here was Vaughn, still clinging to his ridiculous lie. Ava flipped open the case file, pulling out a photo of Lily. "Her name is Lily Thompson," she said coolly. 7 years old, taken from a park in Ridgefield 3 days ago. She slid the photo across the table. Vaughn barely glanced at it. "She came with me willingly," he said. "That girl was being neglected. I took her in, gave her a home. If anything, I should be getting an award, not a jail cell." Daniel clenched his fists. This man was truly sick. Ava let out a sharp laugh. "You really expect a jury to believe that? Because here's what we know." She pulled out another piece of paper, a birth certificate. "The Thompsons are her biological parents. We have proof. And you're not in this girl's life in any legal capacity." Vaughn's smirk faltered, just for a second. Ava saw it. She pressed forward. "But that's not even the worst part." She pulled out another stack of documents. Daniel recognized them immediately. Forged adoption papers, custody forms, and even fake passports. All meticulously crafted to make Vaughn seem like Lily's legal guardian. It wasn't just kidnapping, it was trafficking, and Vaughn had been doing this for a long time. Ava tossed the documents in front of him. "We raided your motel room," she said. "Found these, along with a ledger full of names." Vaughn's expression darkened. The smirk was gone. Daniel took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "These aren't just names, Vaughn. They're children, kids like Lily, missing, disappeared." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "And you know exactly where they went." Silence. A long, heavy pause stretched between them. For the first time, Vaughn's cool demeanor cracked. He licked his lips, his jaw tightening. But he didn't speak. Ava let out a slow exhale, shaking her head. "You can sit there and say nothing, Vaughn," she said. "But your partner?" She smirked. "Oh, he's already talking." Vaughn's eyes flickered with something close to fear. Daniel knew they had him now, because the man they arrested in the woods, he had a lot to say. The accomplice breaks. In another interrogation room, Vaughn's accomplice sat in a chair, his leg bouncing restlessly under the table. Unlike Vaughn, he wasn't calm. He was sweating. He kept glancing at the camera in the corner, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Sarah Mills, the lead FBI agent on the case, sat across from him, flipping through a list of charges. "You understand what you're looking at here, right?" she asked. He didn't answer. She tapped the ledger in front of her. "We have names, we have transactions, and we have you." She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a deadly calm. "You can take the fall for all of this, or you can tell us what we need to know." The man swallowed hard. He hesitated, then exhaled sharply, dropping his head into his hands. And then he spoke, the full scope of the operation. An hour later, Daniel and Ava sat in the precinct's briefing room, their stomachs twisting as they listened to the recorded confession. What Vaughn and his team were doing wasn't random. It was systematic, carefully planned. They targeted children who seemed vulnerable, single parents, custody battles, foster kids with little oversight. Then, using fake paperwork, Vaughn would pose as a legal guardian and disappear with them before anyone noticed. And once they were gone, they never came back. Ava's hands clenched into fists as she listened. "This isn't just a kidnapping ring," she murmured. "It's an entire network." Daniel stared at the names in the ledger, his heart pounding. Most of these kids had never been found. They had no idea how deep this went. But now, they had leads, and they weren't stopping until they tore this entire operation apart. Ava's determination. Ava stood, grabbing her jacket. "I'll call the FBI," she said. "They need to start moving on this now." Daniel nodded, standing as well. "What about Vaughn?" Ava exhaled. "He's not talking yet, but it doesn't matter. His partner just gave us everything we need." Daniel looked toward the holding cells, where Vaughn was still sitting, now quiet, now pale. He knew he had lost. The fight isn't over. As the night stretched on, more officers and agents flooded into the precinct. Phones rang constantly. Teams were being dispatched, addresses were being checked, and children were being found. Daniel stood in the center of it all, exhaustion settling into his bones. But he wasn't stopping. Because for every child like Lily who was rescued, there were still more out there, waiting, hoping, and Daniel wasn't going to stop until every single one of them was found. The precinct was still buzzing with activity. Phones ringing, officers moving in and out, reports being filed. The air smelled of stale coffee and paper. But to Daniel Reeves, it was the scent of victory. They had done it. Richard Vaughn was in custody, his trafficking operation exposed, his accomplices caught. But even as Daniel stood there, listening to agents coordinating with law enforcement across multiple states, he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And yet, in the middle of it all, there was one thing left to do. He turned away from the chaos and walked toward the quietest room in the precinct. Inside, Lily Thompson sat in a chair, her small hands folded in her lap, her doll still clutched tightly against her chest. A child psychologist sat nearby, speaking softly to her. But Lily wasn't really listening. Her eyes kept darting to the door. She was waiting. Daniel's throat tightened. She was waiting for her parents. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. Lily's eyes immediately snapped to him, and for the first time since he found her, she looked relieved. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. She didn't speak, just hugged her doll a little tighter. Daniel crouched beside her chair. "There's someone here to see you." Lily blinked, her lips parting slightly like she wasn't sure if she heard him right. Then, before Daniel could say another word, the door opened behind him. A sharp gasp filled the room. "Lily!" Lily's entire body tensed. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, like a rubber band snapping back, she bolted out of her chair. Her mother, Claire Thompson, barely had time to react before Lily crashed into her arms. "Mommy!" Claire dropped to her knees, pulling Lily against her like she never planned to let go. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Baby? Oh, my baby." Behind them, Michael Thompson stood frozen, his eyes rimmed red. Then, as if his body finally remembered how to move, he sank down beside them, wrapping them both in his arms. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. This was their moment, a moment they had prayed for, and it almost never happened. A few minutes passed before Claire finally looked up at Daniel. Tears still ran down her cheeks, but her expression was steady now. She didn't have the words to thank him. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out, gripping his hand tightly. Daniel nodded, squeezing back. "You found her," Michael finally said, his voice raw. "You saved our little girl." Daniel's chest tightened. He had almost missed it. He had let them go. If he hadn't checked the footage, if he hadn't followed his gut, Lily would be gone. A statistic. A missing child never found. But she wasn't. Because he had listened. Lily pulled away from her parents and turned to Daniel, her big tear-filled eyes locked onto him. She hesitated, then stepped forward, tugging lightly at his sleeve. Daniel knelt to her level. "Yeah, sweetheart?" She looked at him for a long moment, then wrapped her arms around his neck. Daniel stiffened, surprised. Then, slowly, he hugged her back. She whispered into his ear, her voice soft but sure. "Thank you for listening." Daniel's throat tightened. He wasn't the emotional type. He had been a cop for years. He had seen the worst of humanity. But this was different. "You're welcome, kid," he murmured. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Lily smiled. The next morning, Richard Vaughn and his accomplices were transferred to federal custody. The charges against them were stacked high: kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy. It wasn't just Lily. The evidence from Vaughn's ledger had led to raids in 3 states, uncovering more missing children. Children who hadn't been as lucky as Lily, but were finally going home. Daniel sat in the observation room, watching Vaughn through the one-way mirror. For the first time since his arrest, the man looked nervous. Good. He should be. Because this time, there was no escaping it. Ava Monroe walked in, a folder tucked under her arm. She set it on the table next to him. "Prosecution wants to make an example out of him," she said. "This case is going national." Daniel didn't take his eyes off Vaughn. "Good." Ava studied him for a second. "You did good, Reeves." Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "Yeah," he said, "we did." But as he looked at the list of missing children still unaccounted for, he knew. Their work wasn't over, not even close. That night, Daniel sat alone in his patrol car. The city stretched out before him, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights. The hum of the radio filled the cabin, dispatch calls crackling through the speaker. But he wasn't really listening. Instead, his mind drifted back to Lily's face, her silent plea for help, the way she had held onto that doll like it was the only thing keeping her together, the way she had hugged him and said thank you. Daniel knew he couldn't save every child, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. Because tonight, one little girl was home safe, and that was enough. For now. But tomorrow he would do it all over again. Because there were more missing children out there, more families waiting for a miracle, and as long as he had breath in his lungs, he wasn't going to stop looking, not until they were all home, where they belonged. Sometimes, a single moment of intuition can change everything. One officer, one traffic stop, and an entire criminal operation unraveled. But for every child like Lily, there are thousands still waiting to be found. If this story moved you, hit the subscribe button and share this video to spread awareness. Because sometimes, the smallest whisper for help can make the biggest impact. This story is more than just a heroic rescue. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest details can mean everything. A glance, a whisper, a feeling in your gut that tells you something isn't right. And the truth is, there are still thousands of missing children out there. Kids who are waiting. Kids who need someone to notice. So if this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Spread awareness. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button, because the more we talk about these stories, the more lives we can help save.